This is The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, featuring Nicholas Gvosdev, Tatiana Serafin, and Carolyn Kissane. This episode was recorded on March 11th, 2021.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, a senior fellow here at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, senior fellow at Carnegie Council and journalism professor at Marymount Manhattan College. And so excited today to welcome Dr. Carolyn Kissane, who serves as NYU's academic director of the graduate program in global affairs at the Center for Global Affairs and is a clinical associate professor where she teaches graduate level courses examining the geopolitics of energy, comparative energy politics, energy, environment, and resource security, and a regional course focusing on Central Asia. So after that introduction, you may know that we are going to talk about energy and climate. And Carolyn's recent article in Foreign Policy on climate statecraft, which I think is an important new term in foreign policy and, hey, in domestic policy. Because here at the Doorstep, we make sure that we convert and help our listeners understand what's going around in the world, what's important to you, and how what policymakers up high are doing to affect your everyday life. So thank you so much, Dr. Kissane, Carolyn, for coming to the Doorstep. And we'll just start straight away. What is climate statecraft?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you both, Tatiana and Nick. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be on the Doorstep podcast. I'm a big fan, so it's a real treat to be in conversation with you both. So thank you, and thank you for the generous introduction as well. I really, in terms of following this area for many years now, it really has felt like a very forgive maybe the term, but like a sea level change, right? There was a pretty dramatic change, especially over the last year, which I think was also propelled by, the horrific global pandemic that we are all continuing to live with. But there seemed to be this kind of catapulting of climate into the agendas of many countries, right? In a way that maybe we didn't see to the same extent, right? We've seen it in Europe, which was kind of, I see as very much the global leader. But I don't need to tell either of you or your audience that, the last 4 years in the United States was not exactly the best 4 years for policy and action to address climate change, right? We had a president who sort of denied climate change, who called it a hoax, who very much prioritized fossil fuels in the United States, energy dominance, but that dominance was very much driven by hydrocarbons and not by renewable energy. And, what I really started to recognize and sort of, want to look more closely at is the way that statecraft, right, in terms of both domestic as well as foreign policy statecraft was really integrating climate and climate change and action. So the idea behind climate statecraft is just, is kind of the instruments that are available to the state and how they are being used and implemented to address climate change. And I think, as we'll discuss, and depending on the country, we're seeing different uses of climate statecraft.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. As you mentioned, in the last year, it's gotten a lot of more press. But I think the dial started to be moved even earlier by non-policymakers, by people like, Greta Thunberg, maybe. We talk and have often spoken at the Doorstep on this movement from the bottom up, especially of Gen Z, and climate change is really their issue. Do you think that they have really moved that dial here to create this climate statecraft? I mean, it doesn't seem like it came from top down from my angle.
Tatiana, it's a great question. I mean, absolutely. And I think if we discount the role that young people have had and as a as an individual, what Greta Thunberg has done for the climate movement, I think we would be really doing a disservice. So absolutely, and I think if we go back, right, to sort of 2014, when the United States and China came together and said, we're going to go to Paris in 2015, and we're going to go kind of with commitments in place so that we won't repeat what many people identified as sort of the failure of Copenhagen, right? That Paris would be a success because the two largest carbon emitters, what I call sort of the carbon hegemons, would be taking action and showing the rest of the world that they, as the largest emitters, were going to really implement change. And then, you did see then, I think it's interesting because, Greta Thunberg's movement came between, the Paris Agreement and what we're seeing now. And again, I think there seemed to be, maybe because of the retreat of the United States from climate talks, from the Paris Agreement, right, in terms of Trump pulling the United States out of the Paris Accord, that took on, I think, a level of meaning globally, to, in the way that she was able to speak from such a place of authenticity, right? I think anyone who has listened to Greta is not moved by her, she's not sort of using political jargon. She's not necessarily speaking to policymakers. She's speaking to us as, humans, to say, we are degrading our environments. We are not, we're not managing our planet, and emissions are, young people are going to bear the brunt of the impacts. So I think it's quite an extraordinary story, right, as a social movement that has, has really inspired. And one area where I think it's super important to also emphasize is the corporate landscape is really dramatically changing, right? And the way that, she was invited to the World Economic, she was invited to Davos, right? So, Davos is where, global CEOs sort of gather, and political leaders, and she didn't just have a place at the table, but she was like a keynoter, and she was, calling out, what a little bit of shaming and blaming, and saying, listen, you have a stake here, you have to take action. And I think what we've seen, even before this last year, where you've seen a lot of sort of real countries, as in the United States, of course, kind of pushing its own agenda, but across the corporate landscape, you have commitments to net zero, you have carbon disclosure requirements, you have it happening across central banks, you have it coming out of now the insurance companies. Like, there's just a reckoning that climate change is a threat. It's a huge financial risk. It's also political risk, right? And I think that's part of what has been driving and is driving what we're seeing with what I call climate statecraft.
If I could just follow up on that a bit, because I think that this point about the change and the sea level change that you have noted, which I think is very real, occurring within the last several years, and talking a bit now about what companies are doing. We've seen this rise in the corporate world of companies' ESG scores, and that shareholders seem to be concerned about it, but also that governments seem to be changing how they're approaching this. And one of the things that I was struck with looking at was a report that S&P Global Platts President Martin Frankel wrote earlier in the year about, when we're looking at climate and energy, these aren't just simply aspirational things anymore, that there's large amounts of money being, governments are creating funds, companies are shifting. And so it seems that it's not just about making a better future, but there's also going to be concrete economic dividends, that jobs are going to be created, goods and services are going to be purchased. To what extent do you think that moving forward, climate statecraft can be presented not just simply as we're doing good by the planet, but we'll do good by your pocketbook, in essence, that this is something that isn't just a few activists who are calling for change, but that in fact people's livelihoods will depend upon this shift. Do you think that that's also going to be a motivating factor, particularly when you see the amounts of money in the United States, the European Union, China, that governments seem to be setting aside for green energy and climate and hardening of infrastructure and so on and so forth?
Nick, that's a fantastic question, right? There's so much happening, right? And I think that, yeah, I mean, again, if I sort of separate it in terms of the corporate side, in fact, yesterday the Council on Foreign Relations held a call with Larry Fink, who is, chairs BlackRock, and has $7 trillion in assets, right? It's the world's largest fund, and this was pretty much at the heart of everything that he said yesterday. He said this is one about what we need to do because we need to be addressing the risks, but he said that there are tremendous economic gains to be had, right? That this is, and the companies that are going to sort of take the lead will be the companies that reap the benefits being profits. And those that are the laggards who don't take action, they will, they might cease to exist, right? Because there's a whole sort of consumer side. So, because we were talking about earlier Greta Thunberg and, and young people, that they're big consumers, right? And if they don't align with a company's values and what a company is actually doing, they will turn. They may not want to buy those products. So I think that's a real issue. And I think there's, when you look at 2020, right? 2020 was devastating for a lot of oil and gas companies in terms of stock values, but renewable energy companies did quite well. So there was, if you just kind of compare what happened in the stock market, that the renewable energy sector did much better than the hydrocarbon sector. And now we also see, right, it would have been hard to imagine 5 years ago that Tesla or renewable energy companies might actually compete with and actually be more valuable than ExxonMobil. And yet we've seen that happen. So I definitely, and also there's, when you think about the magnitude of the changes that we, I think, are undergoing, and those that we have to make in terms of, Nick, you spoke of infrastructure, right? There's so much work that has to be done, and there are, also, I think, significant employment opportunities here, right? This is a growing space for workforce development and for opportunities. And we have seen that the hydrocarbon space is diminishing, right? It's getting smaller, and the renewable energy space broadly is getting much larger. So it already now, renewable energy workforce is larger than the oil, gas, coal workforce. So I think that's not going to shift, right? It's only going to get bigger. So I absolutely believe that as much as the emphasis needs to be on, we have to do this because, it's the climate, it's the world that we live in. But the other side is that if you're doing it well and you are doing it strategically, and the infrastructure and everything that has to happen, sort of the build out to make this to make net zero a reality is an economic boon, right? And I do believe that that's part of like the statecraft, the economic statecraft that goes under climate statecraft, that countries, and I would also argue that companies see it as this is the new business as usual. It's not the old way of doing business, but moving forward that we cannot ignore. And ESG, I think today we're talking a lot about the E in environmental social governance, but I think the last year has also really put into sort of technicolor the issue of S, right?
Yep.
So racial equity, right? Justice. These are, really, really important issues for companies to confront and to address within their internal, operations, but also in terms of their external face as well. So I just think it's, again, we're just sort of seeing that it's really quite dramatic in terms of how quickly it's changing. I was on a call, I was listening last week to Gillian Tett, who's with the Financial Times. And I remember maybe about 2 years ago, she started a newsletter called Moral Money. And Moral Money very much looked at sort of the environmental social governance space. And I think when she started it, it still didn't feel like it had really taken hold. And just last week, she said, it's like in 2 years, it's rare to talk to a company CEO. It's rare to talk to someone who's in the corporate space, who is not sort of threading ESG into their operations, because they kind of know that they have to. And now there are the instruments and the requirements. So it's also becoming more part of the regulatory environment as well.
That's so interesting you say that, because I was looking at what you mentioned Tesla, what Elon Musk has been saying. And I think his voice carries a lot of weight, especially with the younger generation. I'm completely obsessed with Elon Musk. And so, what do you think of this idea and him throwing $100 million at this X Prize for, a carbon capture competition, and, Jeff Bezos is doing the same thing. And, is that enough? And even some of these reporting structures that have been set up, is it just kind of paperwork and not action? I'm just wondering where we are in the cycle of this. And I know the pandemic has accelerated consumer demands for economic justice, social justice, environmental justice. But is it talk or is it real? What sense do you have?
Tatiana, you guys ask great questions. I think it's real. I definitely think it's real. I mean, if you look at carbon capture, and carbon capture is somewhat controversial and contentious, depending on sort of how you look at it. And some people see it as it's the only way that we're going to kind of, when we talk about net zero by 2050, net neutrality for China by 2060, there's a lot of like targets that are out there, that carbon capture needs to be part of the many technologies that we need to have in place in order to get to that very ambitious target. But opponent, like, those on the opposite side of it, though, think that is it in some ways just perpetuating the use of hydrocarbons, right? So if you can continue to produce oil and gas, you can take the carbon out, you're still producing oil and gas. And for, I think for some people, and this is again why it's somewhat contentious, they see that these sort of carbon capture technologies are sort of not addressing the problem that we are still a very fossil-based global economy, right? And are we doing enough to move away from oil and gas? That said, I do think that, we're not going to go to zero oil demand, anytime soon, nor, we're already seeing the rebound effect. It's only March of 2021. We're still technically in COVID, right? And we're already seeing oil demand back at where it was in December of 2019, which was, about 101 million barrels a day. That's a lot of energy. And some countries are still in lockdown. So when the world is, reopened again, I think we're going to see an even bigger uptick in demand. And I think that will continue for some time, maybe 4 or 5 years, until we see actual peak demand. So with these sort of realities in place, do we just put the technologies out there that we need? And it's not just one. Like, it's not gonna be one instrument or one technology. It's very much a kind of an all of the above that I think we need to be thinking about and doing, because again, the enormity of reducing carbon emissions so that we meet the commitments of the Paris Accord. Again, it's a huge challenge, right? It's a huge challenge. So, I think it's just interesting, though, the way that someone like Musk, who, Tatiana, as you pointed out, he's got a lot of sway, right? He's got kind of that swagger that he can bring into the conversation, and he also brings money, which helps a lot in terms of moving forward with the innovative technologies, and then sort of saying, hey, if we can get these created, then we can work on scaling them, right? Because scale and dissemination is really important. So yeah, I'm also like you. I'm a big fan of Musk, and I think what we've seen, like if you look at sort of EVs, electric vehicles, again, many people would not have imagined that, the proliferation of electric vehicles. And, in the United States, I think we're definitely like moving forward. But China already, China installed more charging stations just last month than the whole world did, right? So like China has really built into their transportation and energy policy that they are going to be, there's going to be a lot of EVs on the road. So they're doing it with state policies, and also sort of more corporate policies in terms of how they're supporting a lot of these EV companies. Norway, already over 50% of all the cars sold in Norway are electric vehicles, and they have the infrastructure in place. We're still very much, I would argue, kind of more of the early stage. We still have a lot of work to do in terms of building out the infrastructure, but like so many of these tech, like if you think about wind and solar, the prices have come down to the degree that they're competitive with, sometimes cheaper, right, than coal and gas. And EVs now are also this, 10 years ago, well, I can't buy an EV because I'd have to be really wealthy to buy an electric vehicle. And that's no longer the story. Like they're very much in line with, the internal combustion engine vehicles, and they're also electric, and they're cool, and people like them. And anyone that I know who has been in a Tesla, like once you drive one, you'll never forget it. Like there's just something about the experience that, it's like, I don't want to go back. Like I want to go forward. And so Tesla is representative more of the car of both today's car, but also the car of the future.
So we get to China, because you mentioned it, the elephant in the room. So China, what that's our main competitor in this climate statecraft, right? You just mentioned their advances in EV vehicles, and their kind of real attention to wanting to be the leaders in green technology. And they have the ability to mobilize resources in a much more systematic way, I would say, than the United States. I just read, and if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend Peter Hessler's article in the New Yorker this week called Manufacturing Diplomacy, where he takes us through Chengdu in China and all of the manufacturing that's continuing without any major lockdown at all. So from managing the pandemic to managing green technology, China is way ahead of us. And what, can we learn from them? Are they going to be our main competitor? Secretary of State Blinken said we have to cooperate when we can, compete when we can. What does that mean? What does that mean?
It's such a great, again, another fantastic, it's hard to answer it, right? Because I think there are lots of different answers that and some of it is we're going to discover, right? In administration, I think there's kind of this sort of cautious approach to China to saying we're not going to completely go soft on our stance towards China, right? So you see some of what was implemented under the Trump administration that's not necessarily changing under the Biden administration in terms of a tough stance on Hong Kong, a tough stance on Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, sort of addressing the human rights, the concerns about potential sort of strategies that China has towards Taiwan and competition in the South China Sea. So, but at the same time, you have someone like former Secretary Kerry, John Kerry, who's, the US climate envoy, who I think, who knows that if China's not in the room and China doesn't get to the table and that there's not some level of cooperation around this, that it's going to be really, really hard for the world to get anywhere near where it has to go. So China is really important, right? And China is the largest emitter. And I think there's a really interesting story in China because unlike the United States, China is not a big oil and gas producer, right? China imports the majority of its fossil fuels, right, that it uses. So energy security in China is I think for the Chinese government, they recognize they are somewhat, at the mercy of the global energy markets, right, in terms of trade. So I think what we've seen, and this has been, probably over the last 10 years, is that, China has really been building out its renewable energy production capacities, whether it be in wind, if it be in solar, if it's in, electric vehicles, you name it. Like China has a really robust market. Just wind alone, like China installed more wind in 2020 than the whole world combined, right? So they are, adding a lot of wind and solar to their own system, but even by 2025, it'll be about 20% of its overall consumption, and they'll still be heavy users of coal. So that's where I call, China a little bit of the Jekyll and Hyde, because they're still very dependent on coal, and they're not going to, they'll probably peak coal somewhere between 2025 and 2030. 2030 is their target date. But I think they also recognize this. It kind of goes back to Nick's earlier question about the profit motivation, is that the world is on this race to net zero, right? We've got all these over 100 countries that have committed. There's a lot, it happens because of the infrastructure build out. It happens because, you're installing more wind, you're installing more solar, you're doing carbon capture, you're having high voltage transmission lines, a lot of that stuff, it will be part of that move towards net zero. And China's saying, well, we're the manufacturers of it, and we can do it cheaper maybe than anyone else. So we'll export it. So it's kind of a part of a climate export market, right? To say we're gonna manufacture the technologies that the world needs, and and that's going to sort of give us kind of an opportunity to be kind of a global leader. And I think with regards to the, where China will be. So if you just look at the 14th five-year plan, right? They just wrapped it up. Climate, I think a lot of people were hoping that climate would be like all over the 14th five-year plan. And some analysts, at least that I've spoken to, are kind of like a little surprised by the fact that it didn't take up a stronger position. However, China has said that they're going to have a separate climate plan, which I guess if you think about timing, when are they going to do this? It wouldn't surprise me, right? Based on, they're thinking about, global positioning in this space. So the United States is holding the climate summit in April. I think it's scheduled for Earth Day. The United States is also supposed to come out with revised targets going into COP26 in Glasgow in the fall. I think we can probably expect that China will come out with its own new targets and ambitions that I think will be very competitive with the United States, and that will kind of show, listen, we're very much in this game, and that, because everyone knows that if China really doesn't, you talk about like, is it just on paper? Like if China doesn't do it, then it's China is kind of the linchpin country because of how big they are and how large their emissions are. But I remember when I was in China, this was in 2017, and I had a group of students and we were looking at kind of energy security and environmental policy. And we met with someone and he said, he said, you have to understand, he said, the Chinese government confronts like many existential risks, right? And, the health of the environment is very, very important. And they recognize that, as we all remember, right? The pictures of the pollution, like the poor air quality, and kids couldn't go to school, people couldn't go to work. And, the government saw that as a definitive threat, right? That if people don't trust the government, that it's a big risk. So the person described it as like there's a sword over the head of the Chinese leaders, right? And Xi Jinping being like at the helm. So there is I think, and we've seen China's air quality really improve quite significantly in a relatively short period of time. So if you look between 2013 and today, like big cities like Beijing and Shanghai are much cleaner today than they were anytime in the last probably 50 years. And so I think the Chinese government, both in terms of domestically as well as internationally, see this as, kind of an opportunity to really sort of do some global positioning so that they can be kind of both as an export model for, EVs, for wind turbines, for, solar and the whole sort of slew of different technologies that, China will be a strong exporter.
Can I come in and bring in your geopolitics side of your work and tie this with the China question? Because I was struck by your comment by this Chinese interlocutor that you were referring to in your meeting, saying that there's a sword dangling over the head of the Chinese leadership, and how this plays back in the United States, because we've seen within the Biden-Harris administration in its first several months really two schools of thought about China. One is that China, as you said, is the linchpin. There's so much that we could be doing with China in terms of shifting the world towards clean energy, climate resilience, and the like. But then there's another group that has a high degree of continuity, intellectually at least, with some elements from its predecessor administration, which says, great, China has these existential threats, so let's use this to pressure them, right? That this is a climate and energy or vulnerabilities to kind of pressure Beijing, and let's great power competition. Let's use climate and energy as tools in great power competition. Where do you think this may end up? How do you think this is going to get resolved? Really, if you kind of have John Kerry on one end and the Asia Pacific hands that seem to be populating, particularly the National Security Council and to a lesser extent the Defense Department, how do you think this may work itself out? Because I think, as Tatiana has said, when we've seen this with regard to really with Russia policy, that this cooperate where we can, compete where we must, never seems to lead to really effective policy. It's a good bumper sticker, and then it doesn't seem to deliver. So I myself am skeptical of that phrase, because having seen it in use with Russia for the last 15 years, with not perhaps a lot of effectiveness, I kind of doubt that it's really a guide for engaging or competing with China in the 2020s. But I'd be interested in your thoughts, tying together your climate and energy side with your geopolitics hat. Where do you think this is going to go?
Yeah, no, and again, I think it's really complicated, right? I mean, not to sort of simplify everything down, it's really complex and complicated. But I think in this regard it is, because it's a bit of a tightrope, right, that the United States walks here, right? Because this is kind of going in my piece, right? When I'm talking about climate statecraft, it's like great power competition between the United States and China, and climate and addressing climate change in terms of each are sort of racing to to achieve these targets that they've set, and how they're going to do that, and how they could also use it to build their allies and alliances, and also potentially be technologically competitive, because there is some decoupling that's that we've seen happening between the two countries. But and I think that Kerry has said, and China has also put in place a climate envoy, Zhenhua, forgive my pronunciation, who was also the climate envoy that Kerry worked with for the agreement that was made in 2014 that went into 2015, and he's sort of recognized as a really esteemed, very astute negotiator. So I think there's an opportunity, right, with climate for Kerry to go in and to find some points and to say, the US and China are going to cooperate here. But I think there's also that other side that, hey, but wait a second, are we putting climate in its own sort of box and discounting the human rights violations and discounting the some of the spying and the stealing and all this kind of stuff. Like, so I think, how do you get that sort of balance that the two countries can kind of be working together, right? Or be seen as kind of being more cooperative, but at the same time, I think many in the Biden administration also want to make sure that they retain a firm stance towards China. And so if you're China, you might be a little apprehensive to trust the United States, right? Because we've already seen, I think, again, out of the gate, the Biden administration did a lot, right? They've only been, in office for a very short period of time, but I think they've set agendas, right? They're very much out of the gate setting the climate agenda, with a whole slew of cabinet positions, and just the way that it's being threaded throughout many of the departments and agencies. And I think for China may take up, hey, we'll cooperate if it suits us, right? But we're also, I don't think there's no great love between China and the United States. And so I think they would go into any kind of cooperative agreement that maybe gets set in April during the Global Climate Summit. But but I think it's going to be a pretty fragile cooperation, because I think both sides are going to be pretty cautious. And I don't think, I think Carrie said something, and again, I don't want to misquote, but the kind of that, he wouldn't discount the, human rights,
Yeah.
but that, climate can be its own sort of issue. But I think then people in the human rights community and many others are saying, but wait a second, you can't disassociate, right? So I think it is hard. I do think that the one, and I think last week, right, Ali, who was your guest, he said something that was really like the regenerative capacity of the United States. Was sort of like, I remember I was walking my dog when I was listening, and I was like, oh, yes. And I think this is what we're seeing in the climate space, is this idea that the United States is regenerating, it's coming back into its power as a leader. And so there are some, I think, really important opportunities here for the United States to build back better, right? Build back better is a term we're hearing a lot, but build back better its relationships with allies, right? Being, Europe, the UK, Asia, right? Because I think, Trump did an awful job, right? With I think giving confidence to Asian allies that the United States would be there. And I think, that's something that the Biden administration is doing. So I think that great power competition in geopolitics is, I think we're going to see it also sort of play out in this climate space in an interesting way, where I do think it can be used as a potent form of foreign policy.
I think that is so fascinating. And so I want to invite you to come back to the Doorstep to see if we are building back better, if we, especially after the April summit and after some policies can gain a little bit of traction. Because right now it's a little bit of paper, right? Things are getting passed. People were just appointed. We have a new EPA head. Maybe we'll have you back, hopefully in a couple months, to see what grade does the Biden-Harris administration get on implementation?
Last week, and I loved it. I thought it was good, right? What's the grade? That's excellent.
What's the grade? It might be, so some of us say it's a little bit too early. So, let's wait a little bit, but I think we have to start grading pretty soon. Finals are coming up. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Kissane. I really appreciate it. This was really wonderful.
Tatiana, Nick, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the work that you're doing and the service to all of us, like in terms of bringing these conversations and sort of taking education out, right? So, and I've been a huge fan, I have to tell you, of the Carnegie Council. It was my first fellowship out of when I finished my PhD. So I've spent many an afternoon at the conference table in the beautiful townhouse that is where is the home of the Carnegie Council. So I'm looking forward to getting back in person one day soon. But thank you both, really do.
Oh, and thank you very much. And again, just as we close off, for people on the Doorstep who have not yet read Dr. Kissane's foreign policy piece on climate statecraft. I think it's a very important piece, and also because in many ways you might be defining what could become the central organizing principle for foreign policy. If democratic enlargement was the theme of the 90s, and then we had the global war on terror, climate statecraft, in fact, could be and it looks like what we are beginning to coalesce around. And that means you pretty much were present at the creation. So it's a piece that I know is being read and is being debated both by policymakers and by analysts. And so again, commending that, and thank you for coming on and talking about it with us further for this time we had today.
Thank you so much, and take care, and really appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.